Hi, welcome once again to AP European History. My name is Paul Sargent, and in the last few videos in this class, we've been taking a look at World War I. We took a look at the causes of it, we took a look at the technology that changed it, a little bit about trench warfare, we looked at sort of the end of the war, and I have a whole series of videos in which I've been sort of going through traditional lecture notes. But in this video, what I really want to concentrate on is the Paris Peace Conference. Because in my opinion, we have a very pivotal moment here in world history. In 1919, the big powers of Europe and lots of other people from around the world came together in Paris, or technically outside of Paris, in order to try and create a lasting peace. So there's almost this golden moment that exists, much like a golden moment existed after the fall of Napoleon in 1815 and the Congress of Vienna convened. But in 1919, they really have the opportunity to make some real differences. And in the end, as you'll see, they ultimately don't. And the peace conference itself, the peace that it creates, and the things that follow are very quickly going to lead to another world war. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's take a look at how the whole thing goes down. Sit back and enjoy the Paris Peace Conference. Just to review, there wasn't much to be proud of looking back on what was called the Great War. By its end in November of 1918, around 10 million soldiers were dead. The countryside of France was devastated. An entire generation of young men was missing throughout Europe. The European sense of progress had been completely annihilated, along with a whole swath of Europe itself. The ruling dynasties of not one, not two, not three, but four major European powers had come to an end. The largest country in the world had gone communist, or at the very least was embroiled in a civil war that would end up with it being communist. And if that wasn't enough, add to that the onset of the Spanish flu, which would eventually kill around 50 million people worldwide. So when the guns finally fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, there was a whole lot of work to be done to clean up the mess. And to do that, leaders from around the world would converge on a small town outside Paris with a very big house, Versailles. So the key question is, what makes for a successful peace? To be honest, it's questions like this that drive historians and politicians completely crazy. Let's understand a few things first. 1. There never is and never will be a perfect peace treaty. 2. If perfection is an illusion, then the goal is to make the best treaty possible. 3. Success, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. Some people will be happier than others in any peace negotiation. So 4, in my opinion, success is determined by longevity. The longer the peace lasts, the better the peace treaty. But how do people negotiate a long-lasting peace? And how could they have been expected to do that in light of the political, social, economic, and emotional impact of World War I? Well, let's see. Now we're going to look at this in 4 parts, and part 1 is setting the stage. So to evaluate the peace, we first have to set the stage for the negotiations. And a good place to start is with the end of the war. With the German Kaiser gone, the newly created republic quickly pushed for an end to the war. The armistice, which actually ended the fighting, was signed on a small train car in western France. Now there's a whole story around this train car, but I'll get to that in a later video. So just keep the train car in your mind. The fighting stopped on November 11, 1918 at 11 a.m. Now think back to what you've learned about the German-French relations in the 50 years prior to this point. Specifically, remember that point in 1871 when Germany beat France in a war, declared the creation of the German Empire in the very room that signified the power of the French nations, the Hall of Mirrors and the Palace of Versailles, forced France to give up the territories of Alsace and Lorraine, and imposed huge reparations or war damage payments on the French government. And yes, I am fully aware that the French nor the Germans used American dollars at the time, but bear with me, this is a low budget production, okay?
Well, guess what? The Allies, and here's where it gets a little bit confusing because the Triple Alliance that existed before World War I would become known as the Central Powers, and the Triple Entente would become known as the Allied Powers. So the Allies decided to hold the peace negotiations in, wait for it, the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. That's right, bring the Germans back to the spot of their former glory and make them sign a surrender. So it's important to understand what the Allies wanted coming in, and a good starting place is with Woodrow Wilson, the United States, and the infamous 14 points. Wilson had issued these 14 points, and the Germans had kind of agreed to the peace, or at least the armistice, on the basis of these 14 points. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but basically freedom of the seas, self-determination of people who are nations to have their own governments, a League of Nations where people could talk out their differences, and a peace that wasn't revenge. Is really kind of the big picture here. But there are others out there. The British wanted to have a larger empire, and they really kind of wanted revenge on Germany. The French wanted security from another German invasion, and they really wanted revenge on Germany. Perhaps George Clemenceau put it best when he said, 14 points? The good Lord only gave us 10, and do we abide by those? So as they converged on Versailles, we have to understand that it's really those big three countries that were going to make all of the determinations, which brings us to part 2. All right, so elements of the peace treaty. Well, look, the peace treaty ended up being all about punishment. There were a number of territorial changes, and if you look at this map, you can see all of the new countries that were created as a result of this. Now, part of this is Woodrow Wilson's idea of self-determination, but self-determination only ends up being for some people, and all of those people happen to be in Europe. But the process of creating true self-determination is almost impossible because of the number of different ethnic groups that are out there. But, to speak in general terms, Germany loses all their colonies, Germany loses territory, Russia loses territory, and Austria-Hungary gets split in half and loses territory. There are all these new countries created, and the Middle East, which had been promised some sort of independence by Britain, is actually divided up into what are called mandates. Now, these are not territories, they're areas where a European country will oversee what happens. And these mandates that are created in areas which might be problems later. Germany is also made to disarm. They set limits on the number of people they can have in their army, and they basically get rid of their navy and their air force. The territory of Alsace and Lorraine gets moved back to France, which has its own problems. But one item of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points is truly implemented: the League of Nations. And more on that later. But the two things that would really define the legacy of the Versailles Treaty was the war guilt clause that Germany was forced to sign, saying they were completely at fault for the war, and the huge reparations payments which the Allies placed on them, eventually totaling, well, a whole lot of money that Germany couldn't pay. So that brings us to part 3, which is hindsight, as they say, is 2020. There's a few things about the Treaty of Versailles that would end up becoming problems, and I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. First of all, a young man by the name of Ho Chi Minh comes in to push for the independence of an area called Vietnam. They don't listen to him. You might find out about that later. The issue of Arab nationalism leaves some real problems which are going to sort of flare up later. Colonial troops have fought for all of the major powers, and they don't get any recognition or independence as a result of this. The German economy is devastated by the reparations payments that are put upon them. Russia, being communist, is completely isolated and not even invited to the treaty negotiations, which creates a feeling of animosity on their part. And the League of Nations ultimately fails. And it fails because it doesn't include Germany, it doesn't include Russia, and the United States fails to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, thus leaving us out of the entire thing. And Britain's going to pull out of it too. So, definitely looking back, a lot of this stuff didn't work out. Okay, so part 4, evaluating the Versailles Treaty. Look, when the war ended, there was a whole lot of joy, there was a whole lot of hope, and it was called the war to end all wars. And so as people began to convene at Versailles, Woodrow Wilson and others were met with a real air of excitement of possibility. But in the end, we have to look at whether this was actually successful.
So I started off by telling you guys that my measure of success is longevity. And by that measure, the Treaty of Versailles was an absolute failure. I mean, 20 years after its signing, all of these countries would be back at war, and that war would kill close to 5 times as many people as the First World War did. But what's really tragic about the Treaty of Versailles is that it came at a moment where there was a possibility for real greatness. Now, I'm not here to suggest that all the problems of the Middle East are a result of Versailles. I'm not here to suggest that the war in Vietnam was the result of Versailles. But they had a moment where, had they been able to get beyond individual selfish interests, that these people could have created a world that would have been, well, a whole lot better. But they failed to do so. And they failed to do so because people tend to want what they want at the time. Now again, I've said hindsight is 20/20. It's really easy for me to stand here in the 21st century and look back and say, gosh, you guys should have done this, should have done that. It's much harder to understand that the idealistic beliefs that this whole thing started with, these 14 points, were really unrealistic. Regardless, the war was over, the peace was done. And that's the story of the Treaty of Versailles. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of AP European History. My name's Paul Sargent, and I'm going to continue making these videos. So if you subscribe down here, you'll be notified whenever a new one comes up. I hope they're helping. I hope you're getting some good scores on your tests in AP, and I hope you're getting ready for that exam, because we're not too far away. Anyway, have yourselves a great day, and thanks for watching.